Welcome. The postures in this yin sequence are both sides of dragon, melting heart pose, sleeping swan pose, saddle pose, and butterfly pose. It can be a little bit of a more intensive type practice due to the nature of these postures. If you have a formal yoga bolster, a yoga bolster might be particularly handy for this sequence, but if you don't have one, then gather up what you do have. If you have pillows and blankets, make them available and handy for this practice. And the story that I'll tell during class is about neutron stars or pulsars and the astronomer who discovered them, Jocelyn Bell. This practice starts from a seated position, so find your comfortable seat. Might look very different than what I'm doing here. It can be cross-legged if you can sit accessibly that way. It doesn't have to be. It needs to be something that feels stable. It needs to be something where you have a little bit of space around your torso. So you can sit in a chair, but maybe not lean up against the back of the chair. And then slowly begin to notice and slightly tone through the abdominal muscles, the core muscles, just for a moment, just to give your spine some neutrality and some integrity. You can roll your shoulders up and back. You can slightly tuck your chin and move your ears back over your shoulders. And maybe just kind of expand your sternum slightly forward just for a moment, just to feel very open in the front of the torso. Check in with your breath. Notice what your breath is up to. Maybe accept whatever your breath is doing. Maybe it's long and yogi-ic, or maybe it's short and choppy or something like that. Who cares? The idea is it's your breath right now in the present moment. Check in with what's going on right now. And then once you've done that, maybe the breath starts to slow down naturally because the mind and the breath are saying, oh, I think we're doing a yoga practice now, so maybe we gotta quiet down. And that might happen and it might not, and that's all okay here. So we'll start this practice with some warm-up exercises that are a little bit more yang in nature. And this first one is what I call heart tapping. And you just basically take one of your hands and take 2 or 3 fingers and then gently begin to use those fingers to tap on your sternum, somewhere on the upper torso, kind of near the heart area. Can be, I don't really care exactly where, but you can kind of just feel that flat bony plate of your sternum somewhere. And just start tapping there. Heart with enough pressure during the tap so that you can kind of feel it reverberate through your whole spine or your whole rib cage, but you're not trying to do it hard enough so that you create pain or injury or a bruise there. So you can do this at a fast pace. You can do this at a really slow pace. I recommend your pace, whatever that is, and notice the pace that you have chosen for this exercise. And you might experiment with 2 fingers, 3 fingers. The number of fingers is just, you're less liable to poke yourself if you're using a couple of fingers. This is meant to just be a tapping and to just maybe notice the very subtle reverberations of that heart tapping. And you can maybe go slower at some point, maybe slow down. You can maybe almost go as slow as a heartbeat. So maybe almost once a second or so. Maybe that doesn't feel so good, so maybe you want to speed up again. Maybe you want to switch hands. So at some point, if one hand gets tired, you can switch the other hand here. And while you're doing this, you can continue to just kind of notice the present moment and continue to soften your face and your jaw, soften your shoulders here. And then at some point you can stop the heart tapping. The next exercise is to actually find your pulse, your circulation, your blood pulse here. And if you know of a way that you normally find your pulse, then do it that way here. Some people, they find a vein or an artery in their neck with their fingers, and they press there, and they can feel their own heart pulsing there. So you can try that. Maybe you're one of those people who are used to finding the pulse in your wrist. So maybe find it there. Maybe one wrist works better than another wrist, so find that wrist here. Maybe even feel it by just placing your hands over your heart and just notice the heart itself. And just notice that cycling. I'm to a stage in life where I don't need to do any of those things. If I just sit quietly and really focus on feeling the pulsing of my own blood, of my heart, I can feel it just as much as I can feel my breath. I'm not sure that has anything to do with yoga or if it just has to do something with age. I can just sit here and all of a sudden I can feel it. You might be one of those people, or you might be someone who none of these work for you. It's just really hard to notice your pulse here. Some of you might be able to feel the pulse in the tips of your fingers if you really focus on the tips of your fingers here. So you can try all those strategies here. And if you can't feel your pulse, then visualize it. Just kind of imagine what your pulse might feel like. And this has a tie-in. This has a tie-in to the astronomy talk that I'm going to give. In fact, the tie-in is pretty obvious. The word pulsar, the name of the star that I'll talk about, is derived from the word pulse, which is derived from your own heartbeat. And indeed, that's one of the main characteristics of a pulsar, is it pulses just like our own blood circulation here. So maybe a few more breaths of just feeling your pulse, or trying to find the pulse. Maybe you're still trying to find the pulse. It's like, oh, I haven't quite found it yet. In which case, it's like maybe go back to your breath here. So the pulse is another anchor that you have inside of you to tell you that you're alive and that you're living in the present moment here. So one more breath. And then from here, we'll move into some cat and cow rolling here. So a nice stable seat. We'll move into, this is seated cat and cow. So if you like cat and cow on hands and knees, just go ahead and do that. Otherwise, you can do it actually from your seat. If you're sitting cross-legged, put your hands on your knees just for a little bit of support, and come into a seated cat pose. So you're rounding your spine. Your spine's kind of rounding towards the wall behind you. You tuck your head in your chin, and the top of your pelvic bone moves back. Your tailbone is trying to tip forward here in seated cat pose here. And then come into seated cow, and seated cow pose is now a back bend. So you're extending the spine. You do that by tilting the top of your pelvic bone forward. Tailbone tries to point back. Move, extend your sternum forward. And if it's okay with your head and your neck, you can maybe look up. So you're creating a back bend here. And then slowly begin to move back all the way into seated cat, this forward bend. And then slowly move yourself forward into a seated cow. Continue this for a few more cycles. You can sync your breath with this, maybe an inhale when you come into seated cow pose and an exhale when you come into seated cat. For those of you who would like a little bit more variation, you can add a lateral bend or roll to this. So instead of just moving back and forward, you can make these seated circles. You can start moving to one side and coming forward and moving your torso to another side. You can get your head and neck into this. I get a great neck stretch if I start moving my head and neck with this. Although if you have a sensitive neck, then just keep your head and neck neutral here. If you're making these these circles. Call this bear rolling here. If you're making these circles, maybe at some point switch directions. But you can also just continue the seated cat and cow. And these can be dramatic or they can be subtle. You're making this practice your own, so whatever you would like to do here. And then at some point, bring yourself back to center. And now we'll come onto hands and knees to get into wide-legged child's pose for some lateral bends here. So other names for this pose are warrior 4 or baby frog. But from hands and knees, move your knees wide. Wider than your hips, so maybe they're mat width, maybe they're even wider than mat width. And then you slowly sink your hips back towards your heels until they stop, wherever they stop for you. Lower your torso forward as far as it goes until it stops, and extend your arms forward here. So this is wide-legged child's pose. Maybe stay here for a breath, but we'll add some lateral bends to this. So start extending. Start walking your arms over to one side. I'm walking them over to the right side. So I'm lengthening out through the left side here. And we'll just stay here for maybe a couple more breaths here. If you're really wanting some lengthening pressure on this left side, you spider walk the left fingers a little bit farther over. Soften and settle. And then gently bring yourself back to center. Maybe pause here before going to the other side, and then go ahead and head to the other side. So same procedure here, just kind of walking the hands over, and now it's this other side, in this other side of the lateral bend that we're opening up here. And then when you reach kind of your stopping point, wherever that is for you, soften, settle here for a breath. And then gently bring yourself back and bring yourself up. That's the warm-up. So we're moving into the first long-held yin posture. So we're jumping right into dragon pose here. So from hands and knees, bring your right foot forward in between your hands, inch the left knee back. And I reminded myself I'm going to be good about this. If your knees, if that back knee always kind of protests in these kind of postures where you're on hands and knees, then by all means put as much soft padding underneath that back leg as you need to kind of soften. Probably still be pressure there. We're not wanting sharp, biting, injurious pressure there. So this is dragon pose. This is a pose that probably won't fit all of us. So in basic dragon, if your hands don't reach the ground, put books or blocks underneath your hands so that they do have something to root on. And we're opening up, lengthening through this back thigh, opening up through the hips here. And this is where most of us feel the pressure, although you can also feel the pressure up in the shoulders here. And we'll stay here for roughly 3 minutes, but this is an arbitrary time that I'm picking. You can stay for less time or more time, but you're trying to stay for as long as you find reasonable for your own body. This is part of the edge that we're trying to establish. So for those of you who are just in pain in this posture, then the alternative to this is half happy baby pose. So you safely, slowly bring yourself out of this pose. Bring yourself onto your back. And then draw that right knee in. Left leg is straight. Maybe this feels good, so you stay here. Maybe you can find the shin or the ankle or the bottom of the foot. And you can begin to draw this knee out to the outside of the right rib cage here. You're finding your stopping point. This is part of finding your edge. So you find your version of half happy baby pose, which I call inverted dragon pose, because it really is just a modified form. It's dragon pose flipped 180 degrees. So you can do that if dragon pose is just not one of your favorite poses here. Otherwise, we'll hang around here in dragon for another minute, minute and a half. And I'll go through the mechanics of practice, the top of it is the principles of practice. So the foundation of practice is relaxing muscle fiber in a supported and accessible fashion, staying there for a long, and maintaining that traction, that stress for several minutes so that it can get into what's called the deeper tissue, and the deeper tissue is the connective tissue system. Joint capsules, bones, fascia, ligaments here. So the three mechanics to do that is find your shape. It's called finding your edge. It means finding your shape that fits your unique and diverse body. That can take a while. That takes practice and experience to figure that one out. Once you have found something that feels appropriate, and what's appropriate is not injurious, then step number 2 is to stay there for a while. It's called stillness. And it requires you to cultivate some fortitude, some patience, some practices to not get bored, which is why it's kind of a mini meditation session. So you're focusing on your breath, on the physical sensations you feel in the body. Let those things help you keep yourself focused on staying still. And then the final step is staying for some time. And for each of us, it'll be a different amount of time. It can be anywhere from a minute to 10 minutes. And you're going to have to find your own. I settle on 3 minutes because 3 minutes is much longer than a normal hold in a normal yoga class. But it's short enough that we don't get too desperate. It's like most of us can survive 3 or 4 minute hold here. Well, we've been here for 3 or 4 minutes here, so we're coming out of dragon here. Slowly come out however you would like. Maybe I'll come out in downward facing dog this time. So if you're one of those people who want to do something really young, you can come up into downward facing dog, do 3-legged dog, maybe take your dog for a walk, something with a little bit of motion, a little bit of muscle engagement to work out the kinks. If you don't like dog, then something else to work out the kinks here in dragon. And then we'll work on the other side of dragon pose. So moving the blanket to the other side. So from hands and knees, now it's the other leg that moves forward. So it's the left leg and the right knee inches back. And then see if you need more padding underneath that back leg here. And then we'll stay here for a few more minutes here in dragon. You can stay as long as I stay, or you can come out early. So keep track of your breath. Keep track of your sensations. If you're one of those people that can easily notice your heart rate or your pulse, keep track of that. So that's a second anchor. We use our breath in yoga because that's obvious. Our circulation is just as important as our breath, but it's harder for a lot of us to feel. So that's why we usually stick with the breath in yoga, because most of us can feel our breath when we're breathing. So that's a good focal point. But you can also use your circulation, which is a pulse, which brings me to the astronomy topic, which is a type of star that's found in the universe that's known as a neutron star. And I thought I'd talk about that a little bit as to what it is before how it was discovered. So neutron stars are the core of massive stars that have died. So when a star dies, a massive star, and what I mean massive is something that's much, much bigger than our sun. When it dies, it dies in a massive explosion known as a supernova. As it's exploding, the core of the star collapses, and depending on the size of the core, it either collapses all the way down into a black hole, or if it's small enough, still massive but not massive enough, it'll stop at the neutron star stage. all the material in the core will get smushed into neutrons. That's the name Neutron Star. So it really is a ball of neutrons. And it's so compact that it's relatively small compared to a star. So even though it has the mass, it's more massive than the sun, more mass than the sun, it's only about 10 to 20 kilometers across, about 12 miles or so. So that's really small compared to the huge size of the sun, and yet a teaspoon of neutron star would weigh tens to hundreds of millions of tons because it's so dense. But since they are so small, they're hard to see. Because they're so small, they're dim, and optically you just can't really detect them except with really, really high-powered telescopes like the Hubble Space Telescope here. So we have about 4 more breaths here in Dragon. If you're feeling okay, if you're feeling like you're getting injured, then you need to come out now. Otherwise, maybe we challenge ourselves for a couple more breaths. And then maybe one more breath here. When you're feeling ready, slowly bring yourself up, bring yourself out. Maybe you come back up into downward facing dog again. Or maybe you would find some other way to come out of dragon pose. Whew. Slowly work out the kinks of dragon pose here. And as you're doing that, I will start to discuss the next yin posture. The next yin posture is called melting heart pose. That's the yin name. And most of us know this more as puppy dog pose. This is the yin version, so we'll stay a while. Again, we can use the blanket for our knees. So just like the dragon, we start out with on hands and knees. So the traditional posture is you start, knees are stable, maybe they need to be a little bit wider than hips. You kind of move them around to figure out where they need to be. And then you start walking your hands forward. So melting heart pose is a back bend, and it's meant mainly for the upper back here. And it's also shoulder stretch. So as you move your arms forward, extend them forward, maybe you have to move them a little bit farther apart. You melt your sternum towards the ground. And then that's why it's called melting heart. You're literally melting your heart towards the floor. And then you'll find a stopping point. Either your shoulders or your upper back start to feel pressure. Maybe it's your head or your neck that starts to feel pressure. If that's the case, put books under your arms or blocks under your elbows to create a space for your head and your neck here. Maybe your forehead just rests on the floor, or maybe your chin rests on the floor, depending on the flexibility of your neck here. And you're softening, you're letting your torso just release. The muscles are softening and your spine is trying to sag from the top of your hips down to your head here. And just noticing the pressure here. So this is melting heart. This is where we'll stay for a few minutes. Now, if this pose doesn't work for you, then you can come out of this pose. The alternative I have is heart opening on a blanket roll. So round up a blanket and make a Tootsie Roll or a burrito shape roll out of the blanket. I already have one here that's rolled up. And what you'll do is you'll actually come to lying on your back with the blanket roll underneath your shoulder blades here. So you'll kind of flip yourself over 180 degrees and then just lay back on the blanket roll crossways underneath your upper spine, your thoracic spine. Legs are comfortable, they can just kind of be wherever they need to be. If you want a little bit more intensity in your shoulders, you can extend your arms forward. So this is the alternative for melting heart if melting heart just is too painful, too injurious here. You're still getting some pressure in the thoracic spine, and you're still getting some pressure in the shoulders here. but maybe not as intense here. So it's a good, that's a lovely alternative to melting heart pose here. Otherwise, if you're still in melting heart pose, kind of notice how you're feeling. Maybe you need to come out. And if you want to come out early, then child's pose is a wonderful pose as a counter pose here. Otherwise, we'll stay here for a little over another minute or so here. So it turns out these neutron stars, these cores of these massive dim stars, have very strong magnetic fields. And these strong magnetic fields culminate radiation from the stars and make these beacons, throw these beacons of radiation, mostly a lot of it in the radio, although some of it in the X-ray and other frequencies, other wavelengths of light here. And the other characteristic about neutron stars is they rotate very rapidly. So they rotate, well, they have different rotation rates, but they're rotating rapidly, and this beacon, this flashlight of radiation that's being focused by the strong magnetic field is rotating around with the pulsar. So it actually creates this beacon of light of initially radio wavelengths. Much like the best analogy for all of this is a lighthouse. So imagine a lighthouse on a coast at night. It has a strobe effect. There's this large light on this tower, and the light is spinning around a stationary axis. And every time the light comes around and shines at you, you see the brilliance of the light, and then when it turns away, it dims. And this is a perfect analogy for what a pulsar does, what a neutron star does. It's rotating, it's spinning, and has this kind of beam of light or radiation that it points around, and it's spinning around with the rotation of the neutron star. Turns out fairly quickly. So the first neutron stars ever detected had a rotation rate of about a second, a little over a second. And so you see this, you detect this pulse once every second here. So one more breath here. And then slowly we'll bring ourselves out of melting heart or a heart opening on the blanket here. Bring yourself back to table. And then slowly bring, the counter pose for this is to bring yourself into a child's pose, maybe knees together this time. Lower your torso, and my recommendation is see how it feels when you sweep your arms back to let your shoulders release and droop forward. For some of us, this might feel nice after the shoulders were kind of being pushed back by the nature of the shape of melting heart pose. You can just stay here for a couple of breaths to just notice the effects melting heart had here. And then when you're ready, bring yourself up. And we'll get ready for the next posture. The next posture is Sleeping Swan pose. So Sleeping Swan is the yin name for a shape that looks like pigeon pose, if you know that pose from other practices here. So again, you start on hands and knees. Bring the right foot up in between the hands, just like dragon pose, but we're not going to stay here. Start working this right foot over to the left side of the mat. And then you'll start to lower this right knee and your hips to the ground, kind of simultaneously. Now, if the knee starts to protest, then try to adjust the heel by bringing it closer to your hip here. Or if you're wanting more intensity, bring the heel away from the hip here. So you're adjusting this heel. At some point your hips will stop. Now if they're so far up that you feel really unstable, this is where a prop comes in handy. So this is where a bolster comes in handy. If you're really high up off the ground, you can take the bolster and place the bolster underneath your hips and this front thigh to create a nice stable platform here. And if this is all not working, I'll show you an alternative. The alternative will be eye of the needle. Maybe do Swan here for a moment. Swan is this gentle back bend. And then slowly, with attention, slowly lower your torso. So you're going slowly so that you don't pass your edge. So maybe, for some of us, maybe we just have to stay up here on straight arms. Maybe some of us make it to forearms. Maybe some of us can just go all the way down to the ground. You're finding where you need to be here. So that's the pose, and this is where we'll stay for a few minutes. Now, for those of you where this is just painful, the alternative is eye of the needle pose. So you slowly bring yourself out of this. You'll make your way onto your back here. And then both knees are bent, feet are on the floor. Bring the right leg up, put the right heel on the left thigh, right knee out wide. Start with the left foot still on the ground. And if that's not enough pressure for you, stay there. Otherwise, the next step is bring that left leg in and hold on to that left leg behind the thigh or in front of the shin with your hands. And then if you need a little bit more oomph, you just start to pull in with your hands here. So that's a nice alternative to get into the hips. If this posture, the sleeping swan posture, is not working here for you. So it turns out a lot of the radiation that comes from these pulsars, this pulsing radiation, is in radiolight. And it was in radiolight that it was first detected. It was first detected by a graduate student, an astronomer at Cambridge University by the name of Jocelyn Bell. She basically constructed her own radio telescope, which doesn't look like the typical satellite dish. It was actually just an array. It looked more like a wine vineyard or a series of fences. She strung a bunch of wires on different posts. And then then you can actually take that array of wires and kind of do sophisticated math and pointing to detect any kind of radio wave that influence the current that run through that wire. So if you look at a radio telescope, that was the way all early radio telescopes were built. They were basically just arrays of wires that ran across fields here. And she built this array as a graduate student to study quasars. This was back in the 1960s. So Jocelyn Bell was actually born in 1943. She was born in Northern Ireland, and from there she went to school, very interested in science. She had a lot of fighting to do because in that age, women were very highly discouraged to not be interested in math and science. So everywhere she went, people tried to get her interested in cooking and in sewing, but she kept saying that she wanted to take physics and math classes. So finally they moved her into the all-boys class because those were the only places where she could actually get enough science to suit her. And she went to undergraduate school in Scotland and finally ended up at Cambridge. And then her advisor at Cambridge had her build this radio telescope to detect signals from quasars. And so as she was trying to detect and study these quasars, what she noticed were every once in a while as she looked at the data, this was on paper on a strip chart, she noticed these pulses that would show up every once in a while as she moved the pointing of the telescope around. One more breath here. And then slowly bring yourself up. Maybe do Swan here for a moment if you're in Sleeping Swan. Slowly bring yourself out of this side of Sleeping Swan, maybe Downward Facing Dog again, or something else. Do something to work the kinks out here for a moment. And then slowly begin to move yourself into the other side of Swan, or Eye of the Needle here. So now it's the other foot that moves up between the hand, and you're kind of inching the back leg back here. Move that left foot over to the left. Slowly begin to lower that left knee and the left hip. Adjust this heel so that this knee is not in pain here. And then maybe you need some support underneath the hip here. Start out in Swan. Maybe this side is painful. So maybe Eye of the Needle. And then slowly bring yourself down to your version of this pose here. Find your breath. Notice your sensations here. So in other words, maybe ignore me for a while so that you can get settled into this posture. And then when you have found a good edge, then maybe it's okay to kind of tune into the story here. So Jocelyn kept finding these kind of heartbeat-like pulses in her data. And she initially assumed that it was maybe some kind of interference or man-made noise. But the more she studied, she realized that, no, this was actually coming from outer space. It was something real. And she took it to advisors and other astronomers, and they too reacted the way she reacted. They thought, well, okay, this is just something wrong with the radio telescope, some kind of noise, interference. So they they were telling her, yeah, just ignore it. It can't be real because it was too man-made. So initially they labeled what she was seeing as LGM, and LGM stood for Little Green Men. They thought, well, okay, the pulse is so regular, it's maybe made by aliens. They said this jokingly, although there was some legitimacy in thinking that, well, maybe it is some intelligent signal because of the regularity of the pulses here. So that's why they got labeled LGM, Little Green Men, to be in the beginning. But as Jocelyn continued to study, she realized it wasn't interference. It wasn't anything malfunctioning on her telescope. It wasn't anything man-made. It was actually out there in space. And she kind of knew that it was some sort of astronomical phenomena. She didn't quite know what it was yet here. And she persistently talked to the other astronomers, trying to convince them, although many of them, including her own advisor, didn't really believe her until after a while they realized that she was actually onto something here. So maybe a little bit more than a minute left on Swan. If you need to come out, then come out here. They eventually figured out that these pulsars were coming from neutron stars that were spinning and had these very, very focused beams of radiation that were creating the regular pulses of radio waves that Jocelyn was detecting. And since they had a rotation rate of a little over a second, it did really resemble the pulse of a heartbeat, the pulse of a heartbeat here. And that's why they got dubbed pulsars. It really is related to our own heartbeat, our own kind of inner pulse of energy here, in a very real sense here. Because Jocelyn was only a graduate student, and because she was female, in 1974, the Nobel Prize in Physics was given to the discoverers of pulsars, since it was such a breakthrough discovery. The prize was given to Jocelyn's advisor, but she was left off the list here. And it wasn't until years later that people began to realize that a great mistake had been made, that she was actually the one that discovered them. And so she was given a prize just recently in 2018 to recognize the fact that she was actually the real discoverer of pulsars. And all these other guys were just kind of hanging around and got the credit instead of Jocelyn here. So we're slowly coming out of Swan here. So slowly bring yourself up, and then when you're ready, however you want to come out of Swan. Maybe it's something dramatic like downward facing dog. Maybe you're saying, oh, I'm kind of done with downward facing dog, so something else here. We can try windshield wipers, just to kind of release the hips and the legs from those kind of intense hip openers here. So come to a seated position, knees bent, feet on the floor, feet kind of wide here, just to get a better internal rotation when you bob the knees down to one side, and then slowly bring them up to center and kind of bob them over to the other side, and do a couple of cycles or a few cycles of windshield wiper motion here. And then from here we'll move into the next posture, which is saddle pose. Saddle pose can be often an intense posture for most of us. So have some props available to lean back on. I have one bolster here. By the way, if you happen to have like 4 bolsters, you can do this with 4 bolsters. And there'll be an alternative to saddle. So the alternative is Sphynx Pose. So saddle starts off with sitting back on or in between your heels. If that doesn't work for you, then probably Sphinx will be what you do here. If you have some props to lean back on, like a bolster, maybe put the bolster up against the back of your torso here. I often demonstrate this posture with my heels, with myself sitting in between my heels with my knees together. But a perfectly good perfectly acceptable alteration or modification of saddle is, for some people it works better to have their heels next to each other and their knees out wide. So I'll demonstrate saddle that way. So if heels together, knees out wide works better for you, you can try that for saddle here. So this is the beginning of saddle. The next stage of saddle is to slowly work your torso back as far as it goes. And so you have to keep track of what you're feeling, what your physical sensations are. And you stop when you have feeling enough pressure, wherever that is. Maybe it's the thighs, or maybe in the low back, or maybe somewhere in the ankles or the knees here. Maybe you can make it all the way back to rest on a bolster here. Or you can maybe make it all the way to the floor. So this is saddle. And you can try to stay here for a few minutes, or as long as you think you can stand. Soften, breathe here. Use your breath to try to soften. Initially, probably most people feel the intensity in the fronts of their thighs. It's kind of desperate. Some feel the desperation in their low back here. So notice where you're feeling it. If this is not working for you, if it's just too painful, particularly in the knees and the ankles, the alternative is Sphinx, and I'll just quickly demonstrate what Sphinx is. Sphinx is a back bend on your belly, legs comfortably up behind you, elbows underneath your shoulders, shoulder width apart, and then you relax your torso to let your spine sag into a back bend. Don't make this too painful, so sometimes people have to move their elbows forward. Or maybe you have to put your elbows on blocks to create a deep enough back bend to where you're feeling some pressure in the spine here. So that's a nice alternative for Sphinx, for saddle pose. Otherwise, if saddle pose is tolerable, you can continue here in saddle pose for another 1.5 minutes here. So Jocelyn was a radio astronomer. And what that means is, instead of looking at light that we can see with our eye, which is maybe what we normally think of when we think of an astronomer. She looked at radio frequency light, and that is long wavelength. It's just like light we can see with our eyes, but it's much longer wavelength. We can't detect that with our eyes, but we can detect it with all kinds of different kinds of instruments. These days, I think of a big giant satellite dish antenna. That's a radio antenna. We're sending signals via radio light between it and some satellite, but we can also just look at space phenomena, space objects. That's what Jocelyn was doing. She was taking a radio telescope, looking at quasars and pulsars at this very long wavelength. And she was doing it during the day because radio wavelengths you can see easily in the day as you can at night here. And this is what brought my attention to Jocelyn, because when I was into astronomy, I got interested in radio astronomy because it was a type of astronomy you could do during the day. The problem with visual astronomy is you have to stay up all night. And one thing that Jocelyn said is she was the kind of person who was very interested in astronomy, but she also was very interested in sleeping at night. And so she wasn't the kind of person that liked to stay up all night long. And that posed a problem to her because she wanted to be an astronomer, but it's a problem. There's a problem if you can't stay up all night and look through a telescope. But she could, because she looked at radio wavelengths, and you can look at those in the middle of the day. You don't have to wait for the Earth to turn here. But we are waiting for saddle to be over with, and saddle can be over with here. So one more breath here. And then slowly bring yourself out of saddle, or Sphinx here. For saddle, maybe take your arms, root them into the ground, use your hands and your elbows to kind of start pressing your torso up, engage the muscles in the front of your torso, and inch, kind of grunt and groan until you get yourself up out of saddle. Maybe getting out of saddle takes as long as spending time in saddle here. And then, since your legs were deeply flexed, I suggest slowly unflexing them. So this can be done slowly and gently by just kind of messing around and doing one leg at a time. Can be done more dramatically by taking maybe a forearm plank pose, pressing the heels back, or maybe even a downward facing dog here. The idea is take your time. Saddle is a pose where you can really feel the reverberation. Saddle is a direct counterpose to long periods of sitting with a slouched spine, which is why it feels so dramatic for many of us here. Otherwise, we'll get to the next posture. The next posture is a forward fold. It's butterfly pose. So go ahead and sit with legs extended out in front. And you notice that I sit on a little blanket. You can sit on a little bit of height too, or a lot of height. For butterfly, bend your knees. Lower the knees out to either side. Bring the bottoms of the feet together. So you're making this kind of diamond-shaped pattern with your shins and your thighs here in butterfly. You can keep the heels pretty far from your hips, although if you're one of these people that really like your heels close, you can move your heels close here. And then if this is enough pressure, you stay here. The next step to butterfly is to fold forward any amount here until you stop. And this is the pose. Now, if your knees feel unstable, you can place a block under one knee or both knees, depending on if you're feeling it just one knee here or some other props. Like if you have the blanket roll is nice and soft. You can press it, put it underneath the knee here. If your torso is feeling, or your head and your neck are feeling unstable, you can put props to stabilize your head and your neck. You can even put all kinds of stuff underneath your torso to support your torso here in butterfly. But if you're fine just kind of hanging in midair here, whatever your butterfly shape is, then we'll stay here for a couple more minutes or so. Get in touch with your breath. Get in touch with your physical sensations. Maybe you have to make an adjustment. Maybe you have to move feet out. Maybe you have to not go so deep. Maybe you can move more deeply into this posture. But all the while, kind of reminding yourself of the mechanics of yin. You're using your breath to soften the muscles in your torso, the muscles in your legs. Allow gravity and time to take over in these longer, slower moving postures here. So it turns out that now that we know about hundreds, if not thousands, of neutron stars and pulsars, they all have different rotation rates. So the ones that Jocelyn found all had periods of around a second, around the same pulse as our own heartbeat. But we've now discovered lots of pulsars that rotate much faster. In fact, they're called millisecond pulsars because they rotate hundreds of times every second. And you could set your watch by them. In fact, a few decades ago, the timing of pulsars was actually more accurate than our best atomic clocks. That's changed. We've studied pulsars more to know that their pulsing actually changes over time, and so they're maybe not that accurate as we used to believe they were, but also the technology for atomic and nuclear clocks has gotten so much better that indeed atomic and nuclear clocks are more accurate these days than the pulsing of pulsars. But pulsars could still be used as a timing device, a kind of a intergalactic beacon system, if you will. Because if you know what the pulsar is and you know its time, you can use it as a very useful reference point. Check out your reference points here, your breath and your sensation. We'll just stay here for a couple more breaths in butterfly. And then slowly begin to bring yourself out. If you, in the forward fold, come out of the forward fold first. Slowly, you can use your hands to do so. Extend your spine up and long here, and then bring your knees back together. Extend your legs out long. You can start to work out the kinks by wiggling your legs and feet. Maybe point and flex the feet a few times and rock your knees back and forth. We'll do a little bit of integration before we move into our final resting posture. So some seated twists first here. With legs both extended again, bend your left knee, put your left foot on the outside of the right knee. You can leave the right leg extended, or if you want to get fancy, bend the right knee, bring the right heel on the outside of the left hip. Take your hands, clasp the left knee, and pull your spine up and long here. And then begin to twist towards the left. You can take the right elbow and wrap it around the left knee. Take the left hand and place it behind you. And then grow yourself tall on an inhale. Maybe see if you can twist a little deeper on an exhale. Head and neck can stay neutral, or if it's okay with your neck, you can look over that back shoulder. And just stay for a breath. Bring yourself back to center, maybe a little bit of counter twist. Bring your legs, extend them out long. Again, and now right knee bends, put the right foot on the outside of the left knee. Left leg can stay straight, or you can bend the left knee. And then clasp the right knee with both hands. Pull your spine up long and tall, and then begin to twist to the other side, to the right. Maybe hug. Give this right knee a hug with the left elbow. Right hand comes behind. And again, maybe use your breath. The inhales to create length and expansion in the torso. Exhales to see if you can go a little bit deeper in the twist. Find your stopping points. Reside there for a breath. And then slowly bring yourself back. Maybe a little bit of a counter twist here. And then make your way onto your back. When you get there, bend your knees and draw your knees into your chest. Give your knees a nice hug. Thank them for the hard work of practice here. We can try some sacral rolling here. So place your hands on each knee. Keep the knees together and then move the knees over to one side, away from your torso, around to the other side, and then back toward your torso to make these knee circles here. Go one direction for a few circles, 2 or 3 or 4 circles. And then at some point, change directions. Go the opposite way. And as you're making these knee circles, notice the changing pressure point of your low back on the floor, which is, you're sort of giving yourself, your low back, a self-massage here. And then at some point, draw your knees into your chest, give them one final hug. And then if there's any kind of final movement or posture that you would like to do, a moment of free-form yoga to just work out any kinks, any imbalances that might have developed during practice. This is your time to kind of just work them out. And then start thinking about what your final resting posture will look like. Your favorite restorative posture, maybe legs up the wall, maybe seated in meditation. I'm going to just rest here in a traditional Shavasana, which is just lying on your back, arms and legs extended, maybe legs far enough apart so you can feet can flop open, arms extended far enough away from your torso so your palms can kind of flop and face up towards the ceiling. Your shoulders kind of roll back here. Head and neck are comfortable. You can put a pillow underneath your head. You can cover yourself with a blanket if it's cold. You can put a blanket roll underneath your knees to leave a light bend in your legs here. All kinds of little tweaks that you can do to make this a more stable and comfortable feeling posture here. And then once you've found your resting pose, then the idea is to soften here for a final few minutes of practice. Release all the tension in your head, your jaw, your tongue, the inside of your mouth. Soften the skin around your mouth and your nose, your cheeks, the skin around your ears. Soften the muscles around your eye socket and that space in between your eyes, the third eye. Soften your forehead and temples, the crown of your head. Give yourself permission to let go of your thoughts. What that means is you just let them float. Oh, the thoughts will still be there. But allow them to be defocused, allow them to drift at their own pace. When they enter your mind, they enter. And when they leave your mind, they leave. And you can leave them alone, unpestered, no matter what the nature of the thought is. Soften through the rest of your being. So torso, feeling heavy, rib cage is kind of oozing into the ground. Arms are soft. Hands and fingers released. Hips and thighs softening and releasing. Knees, ankles, feet, toes on both feet. And notice your breath. You can use your breath to soften. Notice the cycle pulsing of your inhales and your exhales. And again, if you're one of those people that can just detect your heart pulse, notice your blood circulation. Again, maybe you can feel it in your fingertips. So notice your fingertips. Notice if there's a pulsing, tingling in the tips of the fingers, or in the hands, or in the arms. With enough attention and practice, you can actually start to detect your own blood circulation, your own pulse, almost anywhere in your body. A little more evident after very strenuous yang activity. When the heart is working really hard to replenish the depleted muscle cells. A little bit more challenging to notice that subtle effect after a more passive practice like a yin practice. And yet, we are living beings. We cycle with our breath, just like the earth turns on a daily cycle. We pulse with our heart, just like the objects that Jocelyn Bell discovered, these pulsars. This is our relationship to them. See if you can notice that. See if you can visualize your being pulsing just like a pulsar. At some point, begin to bring yourself back. You can start making little motions. You can wiggle toes, wiggle fingers, maybe gently rock your head from side to side. Make little motions in the arms and legs. When you're feeling ready, begin to gently bend your knees and draw them back into your torso. And slowly roll over to one side. When you get there, stay there for a moment and give yourself a big thank you for your efforts and your practice. And feel a deep sense of gratitude for your unique embodiment in this universe. This universe is ecstatically joyful that you're here. And then when you feel ready, bring yourself slowly back up to a comfortable seat. When you get there, bring your hands together in front of heart center. I'll end this practice with an Om. You can either listen or maybe join in. The inner light in me honors the inner light in you. Namaste.